Color theory. Huh? That's what we're doing. This is ground affected. I'm actually wearing pants for once. Also, welcome to explaining thermodynamic fusion for propulsion of aerodynamic aircraft, otherwise known as color theory. And this wouldn't be a real YouTube video if I didn't tell you about all the things you need to do before you can continue watching the video. Obviously, we know what those are. Leave a comment in the thing where the comments are left for in the bottom of the video. Make sure to leave a like. I wouldn't subscribe yet, probably wait till the end of the video because this one might be a little bit difficult to digest. And of course, if you want to support the channel, the best way you can do that is by watching the video and sharing it with your gram. Now, there is absolutely no way I can give you all the information for how color theory works in one video. No way at all. But I can give you the breakdown and how I apply that, whether my brain knows I'm applying that or not, and how you can use this to make your model painting experience a little bit easier. Granted, a lot of this stuff is actually just learned and accumulated knowledge. It's something that you learn and you do it repetitively until it's ingrained in your behavior and it becomes natural. So most of the time, for most artists, this is something that is second nature, essentially. And for us to explain that to someone else is really difficult because I feel like it's something that's super personal as well. There is, in my opinion, two sides to color theory. There is the theory side and there is the personal relationship with color theory. Theory says this is scientifically fact, how it works. But on the personal side, you can have a different experience and a different relationship with colors than what somebody else will have. So my color theory is not necessarily going to be your color theory, but of course you watch the video so you can learn how to paint for yourself. And the best way of learning is at first to replicate. So if you replicated somebody's color palette, you can then make adjustments to that palette as you go along, because if the color palette already works and looks great, you can make adjustments to that to make your own color palette from that, if any of that even makes any sense. We're going to go over three main aspects of color theory and how we apply that to choosing paints for model painting, at least how I apply it at this moment. Those three aspects are hue, saturation, and value. These are the three most important things in order to make color theory make any sense. So in order to break down color theory really briefly before we go on with how I apply that to choosing my model paints, we'll start off with hue. Hue is the color of something. Red, blue, orange, pink, brown, purple, violet, horse color. Those are all colors and are called hues. The next thing that would be very important, especially to someone with a color palette like mine, would be saturation. Saturation is the saturation of color. So technically, if you took red, for example, and you mixed gray into it and you made some sort of a gradient chart from the brightest of the red, that's a saturated color, all the way through to a gray. So you'd have a gradient all the way through going desaturated towards the gray. Essentially, for saturation, the more red the red is, the more saturated it is. And then the last one is value. And value, this is a really deep subject, but once you master value, you can actually create much better pieces because you've mastered the art of subtle detail, which the eye doesn't even know that it's seeing. Well, your eye knows it's seeing it, your brain doesn't interpret it, but it's quite a complicated subject matter. Value essentially is how light or dark the hue is. Remember, the hue is the color. So if you had the color red, the lighter or darker, essentially more black or more white, will give you the value of that color. Not to be confused with saturation, nor is it to be confused with tints or shades or anything of that nature. At some point, I will probably have to make a much more deeper video, or at least try to break down each of these categories into their own categories or subcategories later on. For now, let's just focus on these three and how I apply that to choosing my own colors. Of course, if you've never used a paint, you may not know its attributes or how it's going to behave when you place it on the model. So I like to stick with paints that I know already, and I kind of stay within that realm and don't experiment too much. But once I've found something that works, it works. I'm not going to try break it after that. So let's start off with something like Spiderman over here, and we'll work on just, for example, his reds and his blues. So we'll figure out what kind of colors we would choose to use to make those colors. Now, one thing to note when we're doing something like this, those two colors were not chosen by mistake. Essentially, they are contrasts of each other, but they're also kind of a complementary if you push them in the right direction. They can also not be complementary if you push them in the other direction. But if you use the colors correctly and you don't just pick blue and red just don't really work together. If you use a full saturated blue and a full saturated red, it will hurt your eyes and there will be images of things flashing through your brain and you will not want to look at this thing because it just won't look good. If you understand how the color wheel works, there is something called a complementary color, which on a color wheel, the complementary color would be the color opposite the color on the color wheel. That's a lot of the word color, but that's how it is. So in order to explain this a little bit more visually, I'm going to choose a blue for the main color of Spider-Man. And I'm going to choose a red. If we look at these two colors, they don't look particularly pleasing to be together. So how we're going to make those colors work well together, we're going to need to pick a deeper value in order to contrast the color. That's something that's important anyway, so we'll pick a deeper value for the red and a deeper value for the blue. Already, as you can see, there's still pretty much a big clash between these colors, but we're going to fix that by increasing the value of the red. You can see how these colors are starting to tie together a little bit better. Increase the value on the blue and a little bit higher on the red in order to get it closer, and look how much more pleasing those colors look together. It no longer looks like your eyes hurt and things look like they work so much better together. Now, just to throw a spanner in the works, in order to highlight all of this, as in the final highlight, I'm going to use that. And now look at how the entire palette looks amongst each other. It looks pleasing, it's pleasant, it works, it's super saturated as well. That's because we have used very saturated versions of the color. But at the same time, we've created a contrast by using desaturated versions of the color. Unfortunately, in the case of the blue, that's not necessarily dark enough. So in my case, I would probably add a shade after that, because that would then desaturate the color to the same sort of level as the desaturated red that I'm using. And by desaturated, I don't actually mean desaturated. It's hard to explain, but essentially it's the value of the color. There's more black in the color and less white in the color, and that's pretty much what I'm trying to explain. What a lot of beginners may do as a mistake is, instead of highlighting this way, and instead of using the desaturated versions of the colors, let's say they manage to pick the correct triad, but in most cases they don't. So this is the colors that they choose, and then they need to highlight that, so they use white. Now if we look at how that color palette looks and we compare it to the other color palette, that looks desaturated. There is no color. There's not enough saturation in there for it to be bright and bold. That's not to say that it's the wrong palette. It's just to say, if you wanted a bright, bold look like my models are, that is how I create it. You cannot create full saturated look by adding white to the piece or black to the shadows. In fact, if I added black into this picture, it changes the palette once again, and it's not right if you wanted to have it super saturated, vibrant looking colors. When we turn this image to black and gray, you can see how the hue changes between the colors as they go through their hue change, which essentially is the representation of our value. Even though I feel like I probably made absolutely no sense in any of what I said in this video, this is probably something I'm gonna have to do multiple videos on in order to get this information across. But as I go on to future videos from now on, I'm gonna try to apply some of that knowledge into each video. So I'm gonna try my best to explain the reasons why I'm using specific colors a little bit more in future videos. I'm also gonna start taking photographs of the entire color palette when I'm done with the painting, so that people can then look at those and decide for themselves how they want to adjust the palette their own way. I haven't decided where I'm going to place these yet, but you may have seen one or two of them posted up in a couple of the Facebook groups. I will post one up onto my Instagram as well, and you can just go back and refer to those if you would like to see how I pick my own color palettes. But just remember, color is personal. It's how you choose to perceive those colors and how you want them to be perceived by others. And of course, if there's something you feel like you have to say, leave it in the little space in the bottom below for comments at the bottom. And give it a like, give it a little bit of a share, and perhaps consider subscribing. And before I end the video, there's of course one thing I have to do, and that is thank the patrons for their superb support over the last few months. And in the last week, we got a couple new patrons I do need to shout out for this video today now. David Relic, Keenan, Joe Vitali, Rob Maxparan, and Dennis van Steensil. My dudes, thank you so much for helping keep these lights blinding my eyeballs while I make videos about rocket science. Also, don't forget, merch link in description. Follow my TikTok. Join me on Instagram, and if you didn't like anything you saw here, there's only one thing I can say to you, and that is please, just click the dislike button, my dude. And off. 100% guarantee, not a single bit of that made any sense. Good luck in editing this.